There's a pattern buried in the economic history of Africa that has kept an entire continent poor for over a century. It has played out in at least 3 countries, across 3 different eras, involving 3 different minerals, and every single time, it followed the exact same 7 stages. Every single time, the result was the same: staggering wealth pulled from the ground, and almost none of it staying behind. And right now, in 2025, this pattern isn't just repeating, it's accelerating. The global energy transition is creating the largest surge in mineral demand in human history. Africa holds 30% of the world's critical mineral reserves. The cobalt in your phone, the lithium in your car, the manganese in the wind turbine powering your grid, it's coming from African soil. And the countries it's coming from are getting poorer, not richer. In the 1880s, the Congo was one of the most resource-rich territories on Earth. A Belgian king turned it into a personal extraction machine. A century later, the country sitting on more than half the world's cobalt has a GDP per capita of roughly $650. In the 1940s, South Africa was producing more gold and platinum than any nation in history. By 2024, it had the highest unemployment rate of any major economy on Earth, over 32%. And in the 1960s, Zambia was the 3rd largest copper producer in the world, with a GDP per capita higher than South Korea's. Within 3 decades, it became one of the most indebted nations in Africa. 3 countries, 3 minerals, 3 eras, one identical pattern of wealth extraction and poverty creation, and the timeline is getting shorter every time. Here's what should concern you. This isn't just a history lesson. Africa's mineral wealth is more important to the global economy today than at any point in human history. Electric vehicles, renewable energy, semiconductors, they all depend on what's under African soil. And the continent has already completed 6 of the 7 stages of this pattern. The final stage is locking in right now. This is the story of how 3 African nations followed the exact same economic death spiral, from colonial mines to modern poverty, despite sitting on trillions of dollars in mineral wealth. It's the story of the 7 stages that turn natural abundance into permanent dependence. And it's the story of why the next 10 years will determine whether Africa finally breaks the cycle or gets locked into it for another century. Every resource-rich African nation that ended up poor followed the same 7-stage pattern. Here's the framework. A foreign power designs the entire mining system, roads, rail, ports, to move minerals out of the country as fast as possible. No local processing, no local ownership. The infrastructure is built for extraction, not development. When colonial powers leave, they leave behind extraction infrastructure, but no institutions to manage it. New governments inherit mines they don't have the expertise, capital, or governance structures to run. The vacuum invites chaos. The country exports unprocessed ore at rock-bottom prices, while foreign companies refine it abroad and capture 80 to 90% of the value. The country sells dirt. The buyer sells technology. Multinational corporations and corrupt domestic elites form partnerships that extract wealth while blocking reform. Mining contracts are signed in secret. Revenues disappear into offshore accounts. Political power becomes inseparable from mineral access. Profits leave the country. Roads crumble. Power grids fail. The cost of doing any business, not just mining, skyrockets. Investment dries up. The population grows rapidly, but the economy remains tethered to a single commodity. Youth unemployment explodes. Social pressure builds with no release valve. The country becomes structurally dependent on exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. Breaking free requires simultaneous investment in processing, infrastructure, governance, and education, a lift so massive that no single government can achieve it alone. The trap is sealed. Let's start with the country that might be the most extreme example of the resource curse in human history, the Democratic Republic of Congo. The DRC sits on mineral wealth that is almost incomprehensible in scale. It holds between 50 and 60% of the world's known cobalt reserves, the metal that makes every lithium-ion battery on Earth function. It has massive deposits of copper, tantalum, tin, tungsten, gold, and diamonds. A 2024 geological survey estimated the total mine site value of Africa's known reserves at $29.5 trillion, with an estimated $8.6 trillion in resources still undeveloped continent-wide. A disproportionate chunk of that lies beneath Congolese soil. On paper, this country should be one of the wealthiest on Earth. It should have sovereign wealth funds rivaling Norway's. It should have gleaming universities training the world's best metallurgical engineers. It should have processing plants turning raw cobalt into battery-grade cathode material and exporting finished products at 10 times the value of raw ore. Instead, the DRC's GDP per capita hovers around $650, placing it among the 10 poorest nations on Earth. Life expectancy is 61 years. Over 60% of the population lives on less than $2.15 a day. The eastern provinces have been locked in armed conflict for 3 decades, with mineral control as a primary driver. Children as young as 6 work in artisanal cobalt mines in Katanga province, digging with hand tools in tunnels that collapse regularly. This is a country with more mineral wealth than most continents, and it is one of the poorest places a human being can be born. How? The 7 stages tell you exactly how. It began in 1885, when King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo as his personal property, not Belgium's colony, but his private estate. He called it the Congo Free State, which was neither free nor a state. It was an extraction operation. Leopold granted concessions to companies like the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, established in 1906, which would control Congolese mining for the next 6 decades. The infrastructure built during this period tells you everything. A railway from the copper belt of Katanga province to the Atlantic port of Matadi, designed to move ore out. No east-west roads connecting Congolese communities. No processing facilities. No schools training Congolese engineers. At independence in 1960, the entire country had fewer than 30 university graduates. The extraction architecture was brutally efficient. Between 1885 and 1908, Leopold's rubber and mineral extraction regime killed an estimated 10 million Congolese, roughly half the population. When international outcry forced Belgium to take over the colony in 1908, the extraction model didn't change. It just became more bureaucratic. The railways still ran one direction, out. The wealth still flowed one direction, to Brussels. By 1960, the Congo had produced billions in mineral wealth. Almost none of it had been invested in Congolese people. Here's what nobody tells you about Congo's independence. Belgium didn't leave behind a functioning state. They left behind a mining operation with a flag. Fewer than 30 university graduates in a country the size of Western Europe. No judges trained in mining law. No regulators. No economists. They built railways to extract minerals for 60 years and didn't build a single university for Congolese students until the 1950s. When they left, the countdown to collapse was already at 0. When Belgium abruptly granted independence on June 30, 1960, the Congo inherited the world's richest mineral deposits and almost no capacity to manage them. There was no trained civil service, no judiciary with experience in mining law, no regulatory framework for resource management. Within days, the country fractured. Katanga province, home to the copper and cobalt belt, seceded under Moise Tshombe, backed by Belgian mining interests who preferred a pliable local leader to a national government. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, the country's first democratically elected leader, appealed to the United Nations, then to the Soviet Union. He was arrested in December 1960, tortured, and executed by firing squad on January 17, 1961, with documented complicity from Belgian intelligence and the CIA. The institutional void was total. The mechanisms of democratic governance, resource management, and economic planning that might have channeled mineral wealth into development were never built. What filled the vacuum was exactly what the pattern predicts: chaos, fragmentation, and the seizure of mineral assets by whoever had the most guns. The country cycled through crises until a military strongman stepped in. But first, here's the number that defines the Congo's economic tragedy. In 2024, the DRC produced approximately 76% of the world's mined cobalt. It refined roughly 7% of its own copper domestically. The rest, the vast, overwhelming majority, left the country as raw ore to be processed in Chinese, European, and American facilities that captured 80 to 90% of the final product's value. This is the raw export trap in its purest form. The DRC sells cobalt hydroxide at roughly $15,000 to $25,000 per ton. That same cobalt, once refined into battery-grade cobalt sulfate and incorporated into lithium-ion battery cathodes, sells for $50,000 to $80,000 per ton or more. The value multiplication happens entirely outside the DRC. The 2024 figures tell the continental story in miniature. Africa earned approximately $50 billion from mineral extraction and only $16 billion from refining. a 76 to 24% split that represents tens of billions in lost value annually. For the DRC specifically, the gap is even more extreme. The country extracts the most strategically critical mineral of the 21st century in greater volumes than anyone else on Earth, and captures a fraction of its worth. The raw export trap isn't accidental, it's architectural, and it was designed from the beginning. But here's where it gets darker. The institutional void didn't just create instability, it created an opportunity for the most destructive partnership in African economic history: the alliance between foreign mining capital and domestic kleptocracy. In 1965, Mobutu Sese Seko seized power in a CIA-backed coup. He would rule for 32 years, renaming the country Zaire. Mobutu didn't destroy the mining sector, he weaponized it. He nationalized Union Minier's assets, rebranding them as Gécamines, the state mining company. But nationalization didn't mean the Congolese people benefited. It meant Mobutu controlled the revenue streams personally. But here's where it gets darker. The debt wasn't just growing, it was being personally looted. Mobutu's $5 billion fortune didn't come from some clever investment strategy. It came directly from Gécamines' revenues, diverted through shell companies, deposited in Swiss bank accounts. He built a replica of Versailles in the jungle, in his hometown of Gbadolite, in the middle of the equatorial forest, while copper production fell from 500,000 tons annually in the 1980s to fewer than 30,000 tons by the mid-1990s. Equipment wasn't maintained. Engineers fled. Mines flooded. Foreign companies watched Gécamines collapse and then moved back in with contracts written on their terms. This is governance failure fused with foreign capture, the two-headed monster of the pattern. Now watch what happens next. As Mobutu siphoned billions offshore and Gécamines crumbled, the infrastructure that mining requires, roads, rail, electricity, water systems, decayed catastrophically. By the 1990s, the DRC had fewer paved roads than it did at independence in 1960. The railway from Katanga to the coast, built by the Belgians to extract minerals, was barely functional. Power generation collapsed. This infrastructure decay didn't just hurt mining, it strangled every other sector. Farmers couldn't get crops to market. Manufacturers couldn't access reliable electricity. The cost of transporting goods within the DRC became among the highest in the world. Capital flight accelerated. Why invest in a country where it costs more to move copper 500 miles to a port than to ship it 5,000 miles across the ocean? The DRC entered a feedback loop. Extraction required infrastructure required investment required governance required institutional capacity that had never been built. The dependency locked in. The DRC's population exploded from 15 million at independence in 1960 to over 100 million today, a nearly seven-fold increase. The economy, still tethered to raw mineral exports, couldn't absorb the growth. Youth unemployment in urban centers exceeds 60% by some estimates. An estimated 40 million Congolese are food insecure, despite the country sitting on some of the world's most fertile agricultural land that was never developed because everything was oriented toward extraction. Permanent dependency lock-in is now visibly closing. In 2023, the CMOC Group, a Chinese mining conglomerate, operated the massive Tenke-Fungurume copper-cobalt mine. Chinese companies now control an estimated 70% of the DRC's cobalt output. The colonial architecture, foreign ownership, raw export, zero local processing, has been replicated almost identically, just with different flags. The lesson of the Congo is brutal. 140 years of mineral extraction, from Leopold to Mobutu to modern multinationals, following the same 7 stages, producing the same result: a country with more mineral wealth than most continents, and a population among the poorest on Earth. The DRC's collapse unfolded over more than a century, from Leopold's seizure in 1885 to the modern cobalt scramble. You might think this is a story about one uniquely cursed country. It's not. Let's jump south, to the country that became the world's most famous mining economy, South Africa. The minerals were different: gold, platinum, chromium, instead of cobalt and copper. The colonial power was different: Britain instead of Belgium. But the pattern played out again, stage by stage, and it happened faster. South Africa has been synonymous with mining for over 130 years. The Witwatersrand gold rush of 1886 created Johannesburg virtually overnight. By the early 20th century, South Africa was producing over 40% of the world's gold. It went on to become the dominant global supplier of platinum group metals, holding 92% of known reserves alongside Zimbabwe. Add 36% of the world's chromium, massive deposits of manganese across Gabon, South Africa, Côte d'Ivoire, and Ghana representing 54% of global reserves, plus vanadium and iron ore, and you have a country at the center of a mineral-rich region that should rank among the world's wealthiest. And for a time, it appeared to. During apartheid, South Africa's mining economy generated enormous GDP figures. Johannesburg's skyline glittered. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange became one of the largest in the developing world. Mining companies like Anglo-American, De Beers, and Gold Fields became global giants, their executives among the richest people on earth. But the wealth was always concentrated, always extracted, always flowing outward. The black South African majority, 80% of the population, was legally excluded from owning mines, holding skilled positions, or accumulating capital. The mining infrastructure, just like in the Congo, was designed for extraction, not development. And when apartheid ended in 1994, the country inherited world-class mines and a population that had been systematically denied the education, capital, and institutional access needed to benefit from them. In 2024, South Africa's unemployment rate stood above 32%, the highest of any major economy on earth. Among youth aged 15 to 34, unemployment exceeds 45%. The country that holds 92% of the world's platinum cannot reliably keep its lights on, with rolling blackouts, called load shedding, crippling businesses and homes for years running. The 7 stages explain exactly how this happened. The colonial extraction architecture that devastated the Congo appeared in South Africa with a different face but identical bones. Cecil Rhodes arrived in the 1870s and built an empire. His British South Africa company controlled diamond mines in Kimberley and gold mines on the Witwatersrand. By the 1890s, Rhodes effectively controlled the political and economic architecture of southern Africa. The infrastructure followed the extraction blueprint. Railways from the mines of the interior to the ports of Durban, Cape Town, and Port Elizabeth. Mining compounds that concentrated black labor in controlled environments. Passed laws that restricted African movement to ensure a steady supply of cheap workers. The 1913 Natives Land Act restricted black South Africans to just 7% of the country's land, later expanded to 13%, ensuring that the mining economy would have access to dispossessed labor with no alternatives. This was extraction operating at industrial scale. An entire country's infrastructure, legal system, and social architecture designed to extract mineral wealth and channel it to a white minority domestically and to London's financial markets internationally. The roads, the railways, the laws, the labour system, all built for one purpose: getting minerals out and wealth up. The institutional void that appeared overnight in the Congo unfolded differently in South Africa, but the result was structurally identical. South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy in 1994 was negotiated, not revolutionary. The ANC inherited a functioning state with world-class mining infrastructure, but that infrastructure had been built to serve 10% of the population while systematically excluding the other 90%. The void here wasn't the absence of institutions. It was the absence of institutions that served the majority. The mining regulatory framework was designed to protect Anglo-American, De Beers, and Gold Fields. The financial system was designed to channel profits to Johannesburg's white-owned banks and London's stock exchanges. The education system had deliberately undereducated black South Africans through Bantu education, which allocated 10 times more funding per white student than per black student. When the ANC took power, they inherited mines they couldn't staff with trained South African engineers, a regulatory system designed to benefit foreign shareholders, and a population of 40 million people who had been actively prevented from developing the skills to manage their own mineral wealth. The post-apartheid government's 2004 mining charter attempted to mandate 26% black ownership of mining assets. 2 decades later, meaningful transformation remains elusive. The institutional void was not empty, it was full of structures designed to exclude. And that same exploration gap, Africa receiving only 10% of global exploration, spending despite 22% of the world's landmass, meant South Africa's true mineral potential remained undermapped for decades. Here's what people don't understand about South Africa's platinum wealth. The country mines more platinum group metals than the rest of the world combined. But drive through the mining communities of Rustenburg or Marikana, and you'll see corrugated iron shacks, open sewage, and unemployment lines. In 2012, police shot 34 striking platinum miners at Marikana, the deadliest use of force by South African security services since the Sharpeville massacre of 1960. The wealth is in the ground. It never reaches the people standing on top of it. The raw export trap in South Africa is particularly cruel because the country actually had some industrial processing capacity, more than the DRC or Zambia ever did. But that capacity was concentrated in white-owned firms, oriented toward export markets, and never extended to create a broad domestic industrial base. Post-apartheid South Africa deindustrialized. Manufacturing as a share of GDP fell from 21% in 1994 to approximately 12% by 2023. The numbers are stark. South Africa produces roughly 130 tons of platinum annually, worth billions at mine level, but the value added through manufacturing platinum into industrial catalysts, jewelry, and hydrogen fuel cell components happens overwhelmingly in Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. South Africa sells the raw material. Other countries sell the technology. The same dynamic as the Congo, playing out in a country with far more infrastructure, and yet the result converges toward the same endpoint. The foreign capture that played out through Mobutu's kleptocracy in the Congo took a different but equally destructive form in South Africa. Here, it wasn't a single dictator partnering with foreign companies. It was a structural arrangement in which mining multinationals maintained dominant positions, while the post-apartheid government struggled to regulate them effectively. Anglo-American, founded by Ernest Oppenheimer in 1917, controlled an estimated 40% of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange's total value at its peak. In 2000, it moved its primary listing from Johannesburg to London. Billions in market capitalization, accumulated from South African minerals, were now headquartered in a different country. Simultaneously, governance failure took the form of state capture, a term that entered South African political vocabulary during the Zuma presidency from 2009 to 2018, when the Gupta family allegedly influenced cabinet appointments and state contracts. The result was the same pattern: mineral wealth flowing to foreign shareholders and connected domestic elites while public institutions decayed. Capital flight from South Africa has been staggering. Between 2000 and 2020, the rand lost over 70% of its value against the United States dollar. South African mining companies listed abroad. Wealthy South Africans moved capital to London, Sydney, and Dubai. The country experienced net capital outflows in most years of the 21st century. And here's the detail that makes this personal. South Africa has been experiencing rolling blackouts. They call it load shedding. For years. Not hours, not days, years. A country that holds 92% of the world's platinum cannot generate enough electricity to keep its lights on. Businesses close, hospitals run on generators. The mining companies buy their own power, while the communities around them sit in the dark. That's the pattern in real time. Eskom, the state power utility, began implementing rolling blackouts in 2007. By 2023, load shedding had become a near-permanent feature of South African life, with blackouts lasting up to 12 hours per day. The economic cost: an estimated $50 million per day in lost economic output. Mining operations, which require enormous amounts of electricity, were forced to curtail production. Rail networks deteriorated. Transnet, the state logistics company, reported that rail capacity for mineral transport had fallen by over 30% from peak levels. The extraction infrastructure built by the British still functioned better than the public infrastructure built since. South Africa's population grew from 40 million in 1994 to over 62 million by 2024. The economy, battered by deindustrialization, power failures, and capital flight, couldn't generate enough jobs. Unemployment locked in above 30%, a figure that has barely budged in a decade. Among black South Africans, the rate is significantly higher. Among youth, it approaches 50%. The dependency lock-in took a distinctive South African form. The country became simultaneously dependent on mineral exports for foreign exchange and on imported manufactured goods that it once produced domestically. South Africa exports raw platinum and imports finished catalytic converters. It exports raw iron ore and imports finished steel products. The pattern is the same as the Congo, compressed from 140 years into roughly 30. From the euphoria of 1994 to the rolling blackouts of 2024, every stage played out. Different minerals, different colonial power, different political system, same 7 stages. Same result, a country rich in resources and drowning in poverty. The Congo's extraction pattern took over a century to complete all 7 stages. South Africa's version compressed into roughly 3 decades after democratic transition. Now let's look at a country where the entire cycle played out even faster. So fast you can watch it happen in real time. Zambia, the Copper Belt, a country that was once richer per capita than South Korea. History was repeating, but faster, and the acceleration should terrify anyone watching Africa's current mineral boom. In 1964, when Zambia gained independence from Britain, it was one of the most prosperous countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Its GDP per capita was higher than South Korea's, higher than Malaysia's, higher than Brazil's. The reason was simple: copper. Zambia was the world's third largest copper producer, and copper was the most valuable industrial metal of the Cold War era, essential for electronics, wiring, and military equipment. The Copper Belt, a 280-mile stretch of mining towns along the border with the DRC, was the engine of the Zambian economy. It generated over 90% of the country's export earnings. The mines employed hundreds of thousands of workers directly and supported millions more indirectly. Zambia had mining hospitals, mining schools, mining towns with libraries and sports facilities, a paternalistic but functional ecosystem built around copper. The new nation's first president, Kenneth Kaunda, inherited what looked like a winning hand: world-class mines, a valuable commodity, international demand, and a relatively educated workforce by regional standards. The future seemed limitless. Fast forward to 2005. Zambia qualified for debt relief under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, an international program designed for the world's most desperate economies. GDP per capita had plummeted by over 50% from its 1970s peak. The Copper Belt towns that once rivaled small European cities had become zones of unemployment and decay. Life expectancy had fallen to 40 years, ravaged by HIV, AIDS, and poverty. From richer than South Korea to international debt relief in roughly 40 years. The 7 stages compressed again, and they're still playing out. The British South Africa Company, Cecil Rhodes's vehicle, secured mining rights in northern Rhodesia, now Zambia, in the 1890s. The Copper Belt was developed by 2 British-controlled conglomerates, the Anglo-American Corporation and the Rhodesian Selection Trust. The pattern was identical: railways built from the Copper Belt to ports in Mozambique and Tanzania. No local refining, no Zambian ownership, no training of Zambian engineers or managers. At independence, the Copper Belt's entire technical and managerial staff was white, imported from Britain, South Africa, and Rhodesia. Zambia had approximately 100 university graduates and 0 trained mining engineers who were Zambian citizens. The extraction architecture was a carbon copy of the Congo's, built by some of the same companies, following the same blueprint: infrastructure for removal, not for development. Kenneth Kaunda responded to the institutional void with the most aggressive nationalization in African mining history. In 1969, he announced the Mulungushi reforms, taking 51% ownership of all mining companies and placing them under a state holding company called Zimco. By 1973, full nationalization was complete. The mines now belonged to the Zambian state. But ownership without capacity is an illusion. The same phenomenon that gutted Gécamines in the Congo now appeared in Zambia. Zambian managers lacked the technical training to maintain the mines. Foreign engineers left. Equipment aged. Production declined from a peak of 720,000 tons of copper annually in the early 1970s to fewer than 250,000 tons by the late 1990s, a 2/3 collapse. Simultaneously, Kaunda turned Zambia into a one-party state in 1972, concentrating power and eliminating the political competition that might have forced accountability. The institutional void wasn't just about capacity, it was about the absence of checks on how mineral revenues were spent. Zambia's version of the raw export trap had a particularly sharp edge. Copper prices are volatile, they swing with global industrial cycles. When prices were high in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Zambia boomed. Kaunda built schools, hospitals, and roads. But when copper prices crashed in the mid-1970s, falling nearly 50% between 1974 and 1978, the entire economy collapsed with them. This is the mathematical inevitability of the raw export trap. When your economy is 90% dependent on exporting a single unprocessed commodity, you don't have an economy, you have a bet. And Zambia's bet went bad. The country never developed copper processing, wire manufacturing, or electronics assembly. It refined only 1.3% of its copper domestically. Raw ore left on trains bound for smelters in China, India, and Europe. When the price was high, the trains ran full. When the price crashed, the country starved. There was nothing else. By the 1980s, Zambia was borrowing heavily to cover budget deficits caused by copper price volatility, borrowing against future copper revenues that might never materialize. The debt spiral had begun. Let me show you what that actually looked like. In 1991, Frederick Chiluba replaced Kaunda through Zambia's first multi-party elections. Chiluba arrived with a mandate for reform and an IMF structural adjustment program that demanded privatization of the state mines. Between 1997 and 2000, Zambia's entire copper mining sector was sold to foreign companies, including Glencore, Vedanta Resources, through Konkola Copper Mines, and First Quantum Minerals. The privatization terms were catastrophic. Mining companies received tax holidays, reduced royalty rates, and stability clauses that locked in favorable terms for decades. Vedanta acquired Konkola Copper Mines, Zambia's largest, for approximately $25 million. The mine's annual revenues at normal copper prices exceeded $500 million. Zambia sold its most valuable asset for roughly 5 cents on the dollar. Let that register for a moment. Zambia sold Konkola Copper Mines, its single most valuable economic asset, for $25 million. The mine generated $500 million in annual revenue. That's not a bad deal. That's not even a deal. That's an economic mugging conducted with IMF letterhead. And the president who oversaw it was later convicted of stealing $46 million. He stole nearly twice what the country received for its biggest mine. The governance failure compounded the foreign capture. Chiluba's successor, Levi Mwanawasa, described the Chiluba administration as having left the treasury empty. The same kleptocracy playbook, compressed into a single decade. Foreign companies extracting wealth under terms dictated by institutions like the IMF. Domestic leaders skimming what remained, and the Zambian people left with neither the minerals' value nor functioning public services. The capital flight from Zambia was proportionally even more devastating than South Africa's. That same investment collapse, greenfield foreign direct investment into Africa, fell 37% to $113 billion in recent years, and Zambia felt this acutely. Mining profits were repatriated to corporate headquarters in Switzerland for Glencore, London for Vedanta, and Toronto for First Quantum. Transfer pricing, the practice of selling copper to subsidiaries at artificially low prices to minimize in-country tax liabilities, drained an estimated $3 billion from Zambia between 2003 and 2013, according to civil society estimates. Infrastructure that the mining companies had once maintained during the paternalistic colonial era crumbled. Mining hospitals closed, mining schools deteriorated, the railway system that moved copper to port degraded. The copper belt towns that once had libraries and sports facilities became unemployment zones. Zambia's external debt, which had been reduced to manageable levels through 2005 heavily indebted poor countries relief, ballooned again, reaching $14.5 billion by 2020, when the country became the first African nation to default on its sovereign debt during the pandemic. Here's the number that should haunt you. In 1964, Zambia's GDP per capita was higher than South Korea's. Today, South Korea's GDP per capita is over $35,000. Zambia's is under $1,500. Same starting point. Opposite trajectories. The difference? South Korea processed its raw materials into manufactured goods. Zambia exported raw copper and imported everything else. One country climbed the value chain. The other country dug the hole deeper. Zambia's population grew from 3.5 million at independence in 1964 to over 20 million by 2024, a nearly six-fold increase. The economy remained overwhelmingly dependent on copper, which still accounts for over 70% of export earnings. Diversification efforts into agriculture, tourism, manufacturing have produced marginal results. The dependency lock-in is now nearly total. Zambia exports raw copper. It imports manufactured goods. It borrows from China, which now holds a significant portion of Zambia's bilateral debt, to build infrastructure that primarily serves the mining sector. Chinese-financed roads connect mines to ports. Chinese-owned companies process the copper in China. The colonial extraction architecture has been rebuilt with Chinese characteristics. The speed is what should alarm you. The Congo cycle took 140 years. South Africa's took 30 years after democratic transition. Zambia went from richer than South Korea to sovereign default in roughly 55 years. And the most destructive phase, from privatization to default, took just 23 years. 1997 to 2020. The pattern is accelerating. 3 countries, 3 minerals, 3 eras. The Congo, cobalt, 140 years. South Africa, platinum, 30 years of democratic decline. Zambia, copper, 23 years from privatization to default. The same 7 stages, the same result. Natural abundance converted into permanent poverty through a pattern so consistent it functions like economic gravity. And now that same pattern, every single stage, is visible across Africa in 2025, not in one country, across the entire continent. And the stakes are higher than they've ever been, because the world has never needed African minerals more desperately than it does right now. Now, let's talk about Africa in 2025. Not one country, but the entire continent. 3 times, the 7-stage pattern has played out. 3 collapses, 3 identical sequences. Cobalt, platinum, copper, different metals, different decades, different political systems, same result every time. And here's what should terrify you. The evidence suggests that the pattern isn't just repeating. It's repeating continent-wide, simultaneously, across dozens of countries and dozens of minerals. We're watching the later stages unfold in real time, with permanent dependency lock-in closing faster than it has in any previous cycle. The global energy transition didn't break the pattern. It supercharged it. The colonial extraction architecture is still physically present across the continent. Railways built in the 19th and early 20th centuries to move minerals from interior mines to coastal ports remain the primary transport infrastructure in many African countries. Roads connect mines to harbors, not communities to markets. The physical architecture of extraction was never replaced with the architecture of development, but it goes deeper. The modern equivalent of colonial-era mining concessions, long-term contracts signed with multinational corporations under terms favorable to the company, has replicated the same structure under new ownership. Just as Leopold's Congo Free State was designed for extraction, modern mining contracts in Guinea for bauxite, Mozambique for graphite, and Madagascar for nickel and graphite replicate the same architecture. Foreign ownership, raw export, minimal local processing, infrastructure built for removal. The institutional voids that crippled the DRC, South Africa, and Zambia exist in virtually every African mining country. Few have independent mining regulatory agencies with the technical capacity to monitor production volumes, verify tax payments, or enforce environmental standards. Just as the DRC's institutional vacuum created chaos at independence, many African countries today lack the geological survey capacity to even know what they have. That same exploration gap, only 10% of global spending reaching a continent with 22% of the world's landmass, just $1.4 billion in 2024, means countries are negotiating mining contracts without knowing the full extent of their own reserves. They're selling assets they haven't inventoried. The raw export trap is not just complete, it's deepening. The same 76-24 split between extraction revenue and refining revenue that defines the DRC's cobalt economy is replicated across the continent. Africa mines 69% of the world's cobalt, 54% of its manganese, 22% of its graphite from Madagascar, Mozambique, and Tanzania, and significant shares of lithium, copper, and rare earths. It refines almost none of them domestically. China's refining monopoly, 85% of global critical mineral refining capacity, means African ore goes to Chinese processing plants. Finished battery materials go to European and American factories. The value multiplication, often 5 to 10 times, happens entirely outside Africa. But it gets worse. The energy transition, the thing that's supposed to save the planet, is about to become the largest mineral extraction event in human history. Global demand for critical minerals is projected to rise 50 to 60% in the coming decades. All of it requires cobalt, lithium, manganese, copper, graphite. All of it comes disproportionately from Africa, and if nothing changes structurally, all of it will leave Africa as raw ore and return as finished products at 10 times the price. If the raw export trap holds, and there is zero structural indication it's breaking, Africa will export more mineral wealth in the next 20 years than it has in the previous 100, and capture that same 10 to 15% of its value. Foreign capture is fully active and shows signs of the same governance corporate fusion that destroyed the DRC under Mobutu and Zambia under Chiluba. Rising resource nationalism in 2025, with several African governments attempting to renegotiate mining contracts or impose export bans on raw minerals, signals awareness of the trap, but awareness doesn't equal escape. The foreign capture dynamic has simply shifted from Western to Chinese dominance. Chinese companies now control an estimated 70% of the DRC's cobalt production, significant shares of Zambia's copper output, and growing positions in lithium in Zimbabwe, graphite in Madagascar and Mozambique, and bauxite in Guinea. The extraction model is identical to the colonial one. Raw materials leave, processed goods return, and the value gap widens. Governance failures continue to compound. The same pattern of opaque contracts, offshore accounts, and mineral-funded political patronage that characterized the kleptocracy playbook is documented across the continent. Now watch what happens when you combine these numbers. Africa would need $40 to $120 billion annually in renewable energy investment alone to power the processing facilities that would break the raw export trap. Current investment levels are a fraction of this. South Africa's load-shedding crisis demonstrated what happens when capital flight sets in. You can't process minerals without power, and you can't generate power without investment, and you can't attract investment without governance. It's a closed loop of poverty, and every year it gets harder to break. Capital flight from Africa continues at staggering rates. Mining profits are repatriated, transfer pricing drains tax revenue, and that same investment collapse is visible in declining greenfield numbers. The feedback loop that strangled the DRC, South Africa, and Zambia is now visible at continental scale. Africa's population is projected to double by 2050, reaching 2.5 billion. Youth unemployment is already at crisis levels across the continent. Without economic diversification beyond raw mineral exports, the demographic wave becomes a demographic bomb. This is the population pressure, approaching at a speed and scale that dwarfs anything the DRC, South Africa, or Zambia experienced individually. Permanent dependency is not yet complete at the continental level, but the door is closing. Every year that passes without building domestic processing capacity, without training engineers, without reforming governance, without diversifying economies, the lock-in tightens. The IEA estimates Africa's current mineral market is worth $120 billion and could grow 75% by 2040, but only if Africa captures processing value. If it doesn't, that growth accrues to China, Europe, and America. Africa gets bigger holes in the ground and the same poverty. The evidence doesn't stop there. Consider Madagascar, where 22% of the world's graphite is mined, a mineral essential for every lithium-ion battery on Earth. Madagascar's GDP per capita is $530. The graphite leaves as raw flake. It returns as consumer electronics sold at 1,000% markup. Consider Guinea, which holds the world's largest bauxite reserves, the ore that becomes aluminum. Chinese-backed mines extract millions of tons annually. Guinea remains one of the poorest countries in West Africa. Consider Mozambique, which holds vast natural gas reserves alongside emerging graphite mines. In 2021, a jihadist insurgency in Cabo Delgado province, funded in part by competition over mineral and gas resources, displaced nearly 1 million people. The minerals kept flowing. The people kept fleeing. Consider that sub-Saharan Africa could generate $20 billion in additional annual government revenue from optimized mineral management. That's enough to fund universal primary education across the continent. Instead, that value leaks out through transfer pricing, tax holidays, and raw export contracts. The signs are everywhere. The pattern isn't hiding. It's playing out in public, documented by the African Union, the IEA, the World Bank, and every credible economic institution that has studied the question, and every single one of them reaches the same conclusion. Without structural transformation of how African minerals are extracted, processed, and governed, the seventh stage will lock in within a generation. This is documented history, not theory. We're not predicting what might happen based on abstract models. We're describing what has happened 3 times, in 3 countries, following 3 identical sequences, and showing that every structural condition for a 4th cycle, at continental scale, is currently in place. The pattern doesn't require belief. It requires only observation. So what does the final stage look like if it completes at continental scale? The pattern doesn't lie. Here's what the math projects. First, Africa becomes the world's most important mining region and its poorest continent simultaneously. By 2050, the continent could supply $2 trillion in metals for the global energy transition. If the raw export trap holds, Africa captures 200 to 300 billion of that value. The rest, over $1.5 trillion, accrues to processing nations. China builds the factories, Europe builds the cars, America builds the grid, Africa digs the holes. Second, the demographic wave meets economic stagnation. 2.5 billion people by 2050, with economies still dependent on exporting raw materials. Youth unemployment could exceed 50% continent-wide. The migration pressure this creates toward Europe, toward the Gulf, toward anywhere, will reshape global politics. Third, resource competition intensifies. As critical minerals become more valuable, the scramble for African resources accelerates. China, the United States, the European Union, and India are all currently competing for mineral supply agreements. This competition doesn't benefit African nations. It creates bidding wars for extraction rights, where each power offers marginally better terms while maintaining the same raw export model. Fourth, climate change compounds every stage. African nations contributing least to global emissions will suffer most from rising temperatures, water scarcity, and agricultural disruption. Mining operations consume enormous water resources. Those $100 billion infrastructure gaps become infrastructure catastrophes. Fifth, the processing window closes. Every year that African countries don't build refineries, smelters, and manufacturing facilities, other countries lock in that capacity. Supply chains calcify. By the time African nations are ready to process their own minerals, the global processing infrastructure may be so entrenched elsewhere that breaking in becomes economically impossible. This is not speculation. This is the trajectory of every variable currently in motion. 3 times this pattern played out. The Congo. 140 years of extraction from Leopold to modern Chinese mining companies, producing a country with half the world's cobalt and $650 GDP per capita. South Africa. The richest mining economy in Africa reduced to 32% unemployment and rolling blackouts within 3 decades of democratic transition. Zambia. From richer than South Korea to sovereign debt default in 23 years after privatization. Each cycle faster than the last. Each collapse more compressed. The stages are the same. Colonial architecture, institutional void, raw export trap, foreign capture, capital flight, population pressure, dependency lock-in. But the timeline is shrinking. And now the pattern is operating at continental scale, driven by the largest surge in mineral demand in human history. The energy transition that was supposed to save the planet is, as currently structured, strip mining the continent that needs saving the most. We're not just repeating the pattern, we're accelerating it. The Congo's 7 stages played out across the reigns of kings and dictators. South Africa's played out across a single generation. Zambia's played out across a single presidency. The continental version is playing out right now, in real time, across every mineral-rich nation in Africa simultaneously. The math doesn't lie, the pattern doesn't lie, and the clock is ticking faster than it ever has. Maybe this time is different. Maybe the African Continental Free Trade Area creates the regional processing hubs that individual countries couldn't build alone. Maybe Zimbabwe's new lithium plant and Morocco's nickel, manganese, cobalt facility are the first sparks of a continental transformation. Maybe 500,000 new processing jobs are around the corner. Maybe the $2 trillion in mineral value gets captured by African nations instead of extracted from them. Maybe processing shifts could generate $200 million to $2 billion in extra revenue by 2030, 3.8 million jobs, and $10 billion in annual exports. Maybe. But the pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. 140 years of evidence, across 3 countries, 3 minerals, and 3 eras. The same 7 stages, the same result, every single time, says otherwise. This is documented history, not theory. If this opened your eyes to where Africa sits in the sequence, subscribe, because the next stage is happening right now, and most people won't see it until it's too late.